Sylvester Stallone, a movie legend and the most recognizable muscular hero of Hollywood, walked through the streets of the modern city, absorbed in his own thoughts. His days rarely passed without attention, whether from fans or film shoots for new movies. But today was different. He was simply strolling, enjoying the silence after a hectic week. The city was noisy and vibrant, the sounds of sirens, street vendors' voices, the hum of cars, all part of the usual urban hustle. He passed by a cafe, where a few people sat at tables, savoring their drinks. However, it was the sound of a motorcycle that caught his attention as it rapidly approached. A large black bike pulled up beside him, and a middle-aged man jumped off, dressed in full biker gear, a leather vest, tattoos on his arms, and a predatory glare. Jake, as he introduced himself, walked up to the people near the cafe, displaying his arrogance and hostility. He acted aggressively, staring down anyone sitting at the tables, seemingly looking for any opportunity to start trouble. What a ridiculous little town. No one even tries to argue, thought Sylvester, noticing how the biker was making snide remarks to a few people just sitting and drinking coffee. He tried to ignore it, but he could feel his anger rising inside. Then, one of the bystanders made a comment to the biker, telling him he was being too rude. Jake immediately turned to face him, trying to escalate the situation. But when Sylvester looked at him, everything changed. "What do you want, old man?" The biker stopped and sneered. But Sylvester had something to say. He replied calmly but confidently, "I'm not old, I just don't allow people like you to cause chaos where aggression has no place. People here don't want your problems." His gaze was cold and determined, and it didn't leave the biker indifferent. Jake slightly toned down his aggression, but his words were still sharp. "And what are you going to do if I don't leave?" the biker asked, mockingly sizing up Sylvester. Sylvester stepped forward, but without aggression. He looked at the biker with understanding, as if to say, "You have your story, but you don't have the right to cross the line. I'm not here to argue, but I'm telling you plainly, step back, because this is not the place for your aggression." Sylvester's gaze was resolute, and the biker, though still irritated, understood that this encounter wouldn't end in a fight. He looked once more at the man in front of him, and, despite his desire to continue the conflict, turned back to his motorcycle. "You've got something to say, but I don't want to deal with you," the biker said as he mounted his bike. Sylvester stood, watching the biker disappear into the distance. But the sense of dissatisfaction remained. He didn't like violence, but he couldn't stand by when he saw someone trying to oppress others. A moment of silence stretched on, and Sylvester found a spot on a bench near the cafe. He felt that something important had happened, and this encounter was no accident. But what he could do with it was still unclear. The conclusion of this encounter remained open, but Sylvester felt that he had changed something in this world, even if it was just a small step. Sylvester sat on the bench, watching as the biker disappeared into the distance, feeling the anger that had been pulsing inside him slowly fade away. But that was not enough to calm his soul. His heart still beat faster, as if ready to explode again. The inner struggle continued. On one hand, he felt relief that the situation hadn't escalated into a conflict, but on the other hand, something inside him resented how the biker had just walked away, as if nothing had happened. Sylvester glanced again at the cafe, where people continued sitting, oblivious to the event that had just unfolded. They went on with their day, as if nothing had happened, and that disappointed him. They didn't notice. They didn't understand why I did it, he thought. But maybe that didn't matter? Maybe he just couldn't stand by when he saw such aggression, when he was forced to stand next to injustice that cast a shadow on others. He often told himself that he didn't want to be a hero, but here, on this street, on this bench, he felt he had taken the right step. He took a deep breath, and something important flashed through his mind. Something had changed within him, but what exactly? Had he really changed anything more than just a few minutes of emotional tension? Maybe he needed more. He realized that now it was important not only to react, but to keep acting. He couldn't just leave it as it was. Approaching the cafe entrance, Sylvester felt tension in his body, but also determination. He needed to talk to the people who had witnessed the conflict. He returned to the table where a few passers-by were sitting. One of them, a young man with dark hair and a serious expression, was just lifting a cup of coffee. Sylvester sat down beside him. "Did you see what happened?" he asked, trying to speak calmly, though his voice carried a weary determination. The young man tensed slightly, but didn't shy away from answering. "Yes, I saw. It was a little scary, but you managed to stop it. That was good." Sylvester clenched his fingers on the table, feeling how important it was to hear that. "But why didn't you all react? Why didn't you stand up for yourselves?" he asked, looking directly into the young man's eyes. The man paused for a moment before responding. "We were afraid that something might happen to us. We didn't want trouble." Sylvester took a deep breath, realizing that it was this fear that kept many people in the shadows. They were afraid of being a danger to others, afraid they might become victims of conflict if they spoke up. And I understand that fear. But if no one stops aggression, then we all become part of that system. "We can't allow people to behave like that," Sylvester said, feeling his words come from deep within his soul. The young man nodded. "I understand what you mean. I'd probably be just as scared. But you changed everything just by standing there and telling the truth." These words lingered in the air. Sylvester, although satisfied that the situation hadn't spiraled out of control, still realized that what had happened here was only part of a bigger problem. A problem of fear, indifference, and a lack of willingness to stand up for others. But here he was, Sylvester Stallone, a legend who, in his films, had always fought against injustice and aggression. And now he understood. To change the world, it wasn't necessary to fight it in the traditional way. One could simply tell the truth, ask the right questions, and be an example for others. Maybe this small step is the real beginning of change, he thought. And with that thought, he stood up, leaving the cafe with a new understanding that even one person could change a lot. But in his heart, there remained hope that this encounter wouldn't be the last. And that change was possible, even if it started with a simple dialogue. Sylvester stepped out of the cafe, feeling the cold wind pierce through his coat, but it no longer had the power to extinguish the inner fire burning within him. He walked slowly down the street, reflecting on everything that had happened. Had he really changed anything? Was this one step enough for real change? Questions swirled in his mind, and he couldn't find answers. But one thought clearly defined his next path. If I don't change now, then who will? He couldn't leave everything to chance. Something had to change, and it had to start with him. Amid the confusion, he noticed how his steps had become more determined. Now he was no longer just thinking about himself, but about how to do more. What if he could help others overcome this fear? What if he could conquer the indifference that had overtaken the entire community? He unconsciously began noticing everyone he passed by, those who seemed oblivious to what was happening around them. He again thought about the people in the cafe. Why didn't they stand up? He realized they were afraid. But could this fear be changed? What would it take for people to stop staying silent and start taking action? Sylvester stopped, staring at the light in the distance, flickering in the wind. He needed to find the answer. He understood that he couldn't do it alone, because even the best idea wouldn't change the world without the support of others. The next day he met with a few acquaintances who, from what he observed, were people who also refused to stand by the problem he had set before himself. Together, they discussed how they could create a support community for those who feared expressing their civic stance due to fear of consequences. They decided to gather a few people for a discussion and start a small campaign to help others not remain indifferent. Time passed, and Sylvester felt his strength and determination grow. All these small steps had potential, and each one added more meaning. Perhaps this was just the beginning of something big. Maybe he could gather people like him, and together they could change the streets, change their surroundings. And even if it took years, he was ready to start. A few weeks later, on one of those very streets that had become a symbol of change for him, people began to notice what was happening. Sylvester and his new friends held their first meeting, where they discussed how to combat the sense of hopelessness and apathy that had gripped the community. They talked about support, about how important it is not to stay silent when witnessing injustice, even in its smallest forms. With each step, Sylvester felt that people were no longer looking at him as just one man, but as part of something bigger. And in his heart, hope began to bloom. He was ready to continue. And with every new voice, with every new person who joined, he felt that, perhaps, he had truly changed something. And this was only the beginning. From that moment on, he knew for sure, real change starts with each of us. And now, when he looked into the future, he saw not just streets, but streets filled with people ready to act. Time passed, but Sylvester did not stop his efforts. He understood that even the smallest changes required a lot of work and patience. Every day, he met new people, those seeking support, those who wanted to change their situation, those who simply couldn't stay silent anymore. Many of them didn't believe they could change anything, but Sylvester saw how small steps were starting to give meaning to their actions. The streets began to come alive, not just because of his campaign, but also thanks to everyone who joined the movement. People began paying attention to what was happening around them. Injustice, which had once been hard to see or hear, started to emerge, and with it came a new form of determination to act. One day, while walking through the city, Sylvester noticed a young woman approaching a group discussing a case where someone had been the victim of aggression on the street. She seemed to have been in a similar situation before, and this prompted her to leave her home and participate in the discussion for the first time. Her words were calm but poignant, and it was these words that became decisive for several people in the group who had still been unsure whether to join in. "I've been there too," she said quietly but with strength in her voice. "Back then, I decided to stay silent. I was afraid of the consequences. But now I understand that silence only gives strength to those who do evil. If we stay silent, they will feel invincible." Her words left a mark on the heart of everyone who was listening. Sylvester couldn't help but notice how the atmosphere around him had changed. More people were beginning to speak up. And although the path was still difficult and full of challenges, Sylvester could see how slowly, but steadily, the support was growing. He had an idea that maybe the next step would be to organize public actions, events that not only drew attention to the issues, but also helped people express their views, talk about injustice, and find solutions together. He thought about everything they had achieved, and at the same time, he realized how much was still left to be done. At the next meeting, when Sylvester shared his ideas, the group decided to organize the first public event. It became an opportunity for everyone to speak up and not be afraid of being heard. Sylvester understood that this moment wasn't just a chance for change, but also an opportunity to inspire others, to give them hope that even the smallest voice could be heard. When the day of the event arrived, the street where they had gathered was filled with people. A light breeze fluttered their posters, which had slogans like, "Silence is not an option. Our voices matter. Don't be afraid, speak up." Everyone gathered, ready to raise their voices for change. Sylvester stood among the crowd, realizing that this was only the beginning. He saw around him a variety of people, young people, middle-aged individuals, even the elderly, who had come together to show their support and desire for a better world. It was more than just an event. It was an expression of unity, a shared goal, and a belief that they had the power to change the world. The first changes they had begun implementing were now blossoming in many other cities and villages. People were no longer afraid to be heard, and Sylvester understood. Even the smallest steps matter if they are taken together. At that moment, he felt that his goal was no longer just change in one city, but something much bigger, a movement capable of uniting and changing. Sylvester looked at the people standing next to him and felt how important this moment was for each of them. And although he didn't know what the future would bring, he knew for sure that this was the beginning of something real, something important. And while the discussions around him continued, he felt that his journey was just beginning. Sylvester continued working on change, but now with a new understanding that true power lies not only in organizing actions or large slogans, but in making each participant feel part of something greater. He knew that support was not just about a few people on the streets or in squares, but something deeper that could change not only the situation on the surface, but also the attitude toward life as a whole. Months went by, and Sylvester's movement gained more and more support. People from different corners of the country reached out, shared their stories, and most importantly, started to act. They were no longer afraid to talk about what hurt them and stopped hiding their emotions. The streets became a place where problems could be discussed, solutions sought, and people could help one another. Over time, Sylvester became not just an activist, but a symbol of change. His face became familiar to many, and his words became a refrain for those still hesitant. He organized a series of training sessions and lectures, where together with other leaders of the movement, he shared his experience and taught people how to react to injustice, how to not lose hope, and how to support each other in times of weakness. But even with all these achievements, he remained true to his main goal, to change the situation in society, to show that the power is not in silence, but in speaking up. And this was important not only for him, but also for those who had placed their hopes in him. His movement grew, becoming more large-scale and significant, but he never forgot where it all began, with a small idea, a big heart, and a desire to make the world better. He believed that this movement would never stop because, in reality, it was not just a fight, but a search for truth and justice for every person. And as he looked at these changes, he realized the true victory is not just the fight for justice, but the ability of every person to feel like an important part of a larger world, where their voice matters. And that was the greatest victory.